There is a specific kind of failure that is harder to write about than ordinary failure. Ordinary failure is simple. The person wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't prepared. You can point at the deficit and explain it. The gap between what was required and what was available is visible and measurable. But Franklin Pierce doesn't fit that story. Franklin Pierce was extraordinarily capable. He was charming in a way that people who knew him described as almost physical. A warmth that came off him like heat, that made everyone in a room feel seen and valued. He was a war hero. He was a skilled lawyer and a gifted politician who had risen faster through American public life than almost anyone of his generation. He was elected president at 48 with a majority so large it was almost embarrassing, against a campaign that barely put up a fight. And then he became one of the worst presidents in American history. Not through incompetence, not through laziness, not through corruption in the simple sense of taking money or using office for personal gain. He became one of the worst presidents in American history through a combination of personal tragedy, ideological rigidity, a desperate need to be liked, and a catastrophic misreading of which way history was moving. He made decisions that were, in his own framework, reasonable and defensible. They also helped make the Civil War inevitable. He served 4 years and was denied renomination by his own party. He spent the rest of his life watching the catastrophe unfold and defending the choices that had contributed to it, drinking more and more heavily, and dying in 1869 as one of the most reviled men in the country he had once led. This is Franklin Pierce, and his story is one of the most genuinely tragic in American presidential history. Not because tragedy was done to him, but because he did it, clearly, in daylight, while everyone was watching and couldn't stop himself. Let's go back to the beginning, because where Franklin Pierce came from matters enormously for understanding who he became and what broke him. He was born in 1804 in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, the 6th of 8 children of Benjamin Pierce, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, a farmer, and eventually the governor of New Hampshire. The elder Pierce was a hard man, not cruel, but demanding, physically tough, deeply patriotic in the unsentimental way of men who had actually fought for the country rather than simply inheriting it. Growing up in the Pierce household meant growing up with the Revolution as a living presence. Benjamin Pierce had been at Bunker Hill. He had survived Valley Forge. He carried the war in his body and his memory, and he communicated to his children a sense of the Republic as something earned, fragile, and sacred. You served it. You didn't use it. You gave to it more than you took. Franklin absorbed this. He took it seriously. The idea of the Union as a precious and vulnerable thing, purchased at enormous cost, maintained by constant effort, threatened by the selfishness and faction-mindedness of those who put their particular interests above the common good. This idea was not an abstraction for Pierce. It was almost a religion. He was also, from early childhood, spectacularly good at making people love him. This is not a small thing. It is in some ways the central fact of his life, more important than his politics, more important than his war record, more important even than the tragedies that would later define him. Pierce was one of those rare people who genuinely lit up when they were with other people. He paid attention. He remembered names. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He made you feel, in his presence, that you were the most interesting person in the room. In politics, this is a superpower. In life, it can become a trap, because the desperate need to be liked, to have everyone leave the room feeling good about you, is fundamentally incompatible with making hard decisions that hurt people. Pierce went to Bowdoin College in Maine, where he graduated in 1824. His classmates included 2 men who would become his lifelong friends and whose lives would intersect with his in ways that shaped everything. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who would become one of the greatest American novelists of the 19th century and who wrote a campaign biography of Pierce in 1852, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who would become the most popular American poet of his era. Pierce was not the most academically distinguished of the 3. He ranked near the bottom of his class initially, partying, socializing, doing exactly what a charming young man with more social gifts than scholarly inclination tends to do in college. And then he had a period of intense effort, climbed the rankings, and graduated with creditable results. This pattern, coasting, realizing the danger, applying himself intensely, succeeding, would repeat itself throughout his life. He read law, was admitted to the bar, and entered politics almost immediately. New Hampshire in the 1820s was a Democratic state, and Pierce was a Democrat, a Jacksonian Democrat, which meant he believed in limited federal government, states' rights, the supremacy of the white working class over entrenched elites, and the fundamental unity of the Democratic coalition that stretched from New England mills to Southern plantations. He served in the New Hampshire legislature from 1829 to 1833, became Speaker of the State House, and was then elected to the United States House of Representatives at 29. In 1837, he was elected to the United States Senate, the youngest senator from New Hampshire in history at 32. The velocity of this ascent is remarkable. Pierce was moving faster through American political life than almost anyone of his generation. He was in the Senate at 32, with decades of political advancement ahead of him, representing a state that was reliably Democratic and supporting a president, Andrew Jackson, who was transforming the party into a genuine mass movement. And then he resigned. In 1842, Pierce resigned from the Senate voluntarily, without being forced out, without a scandal, without any of the usual reasons that make politicians leave office before their time. He resigned because his wife asked him to. Jane Appleton Pierce is one of the saddest figures in American presidential history, and she deserves more than the footnote she usually receives. She was the daughter of a Congregationalist minister, deeply religious, deeply introverted, deeply unsuited to public life, in a way that went beyond preference into something that looks, from a modern perspective, like severe anxiety and depression. She found Washington overwhelming, the political life exhausting, the constant sociability that Pierce required and generated physically and psychologically draining. She hated Washington, she hated politics, she hated the drinking that went with it, and there was a lot of drinking. Pierce was a man who drank, not in the constant way of a committed alcoholic, but in the social way of his era and class, and that social drinking was, over time, something more. Jane saw it and feared it. She wanted him home. She wanted him in New Hampshire, practicing law, raising their children, living a normal life. Pierce loved her, genuinely, devotedly, with a sincerity that none of his contemporaries doubted. And so he came home. He practiced law in Concord. He became, by all accounts, an excellent lawyer, skilled, successful, respected. He had a domestic life that was still shadowed by grief. Their first son had died in infancy. Their second son, Frank Robert, died at 4 years old in 1843, just after Pierce returned to New Hampshire. There was a third son, Benjamin, called Benny, who was alive and healthy, and whom his parents wrapped in the accumulated love of all the children they had lost. For nearly a decade, Pierce was a private citizen. He was not forgotten. He was still a prominent figure in New Hampshire Democratic politics, still connected to the National Party, still someone who people mentioned when speculating about future candidates. But he was not pursuing the presidency. He was not building toward anything beyond his practice and his family. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 brought him back into public life, and in a specific way that mattered for everything that followed. Pierce volunteered. He was 32 when the war began, a former senator with no military obligation whatsoever, with a wife who desperately did not want him to go, and a young son at home. He volunteered anyway. He was appointed a brigadier general, a political appointment, the kind that was common in the era, which meant he led troops despite having no prior military experience. He served in the campaign against Mexico City under General Winfield Scott, who would later run against him for president. The campaign was arduous, and Pierce acquitted himself adequately. He suffered injuries. During one engagement, his horse threw him. He fell awkwardly, and the injury to his leg was serious enough to cause him pain for the rest of his life. There is some evidence that the pain, and the treatment of the pain, contributed to his drinking. There is also something more embarrassing in the record, which his political opponents would gleefully deploy in 1852. In the same engagement where he was injured by his horse, Pierce fainted. He lost consciousness during a battle. He was revived, continued fighting, and was by most accounts not cowardly. But the image of him fainting under fire was politically radioactive and earned him the nickname, from his enemies, of the Fainting General. Whether this was unfair, fainting from pain after being thrown by a horse is not cowardice, didn't matter much in political terms. The nickname stuck. He came home in 1848 a general, a Mexican war veteran, a man who had volunteered when he could easily have stayed home. This gave him something that his prior career of legislative service hadn't: a military credential, a physical embodiment of patriotism, a story to tell about sacrifice and service that resonated with an electorate that respected military men. Jane had not wanted him to go. She had prayed, apparently, that he would not be given the general's commission that would send him to Mexico. When the commission came anyway, it registered for her as something close to a betrayal, not by Pierce specifically, but by the world that kept pulling her husband away from the life she needed them to have together. She didn't know, in 1848, that worse was coming. The Democratic Party in 1852 was a fractured mess, and its fractures were almost entirely about slavery. The Compromise of 1850, which Millard Fillmore had signed, which had included the catastrophic Fugitive Slave Act, had temporarily diffused the immediate crisis, but had satisfied nobody. The northern wing of the party was increasingly restless about the party's southern orientation. The southern wing was suspicious of any northern candidate who hadn't made sufficiently clear his commitment to protecting slavery where it existed and not obstructing its expansion. The leading candidates going into the 1852 convention were James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, Lewis Cass of Michigan, and Stephen Douglas of Illinois. All three were well known. All three had significant support, and all three were unacceptable to enough delegates that none of them could lock up the nomination. Pierce emerged as the compromise candidate, the classic dark horse. He was northern, which was necessary. He was from a small, politically insignificant state, which meant he had made fewer enemies than men who had spent decades in the center of national controversies. He was a veteran, which was an asset, and he was explicitly and completely acceptable to the southern wing of the party because his entire political career had been built on the position that slavery was a southern institution that northern politicians should leave alone. He was nominated on the 49th ballot. The Whig candidate was Winfield Scott, the same general under whom Pierce had served in Mexico. Scott's campaign was one of the weakest in American presidential history. The Whig Party was already dissolving. Scott was pompous, politically inept, unable to hold together the collapsing northern and southern wings of his own coalition. Pierce won 254 electoral votes to Scott's 42. The popular vote was less lopsided but still decisive. It was one of the most complete presidential victories in American history to that point. The family was living in Concord when the news came. Jane Pierce fainted when she heard. She had not wanted this. She had believed, apparently, that the nomination was unlikely enough that the risk was manageable. The reality of the presidency, Washington, the social obligations, the public life she had fled from for a decade, now descended on her with the full weight of inevitability. And then, 2 months before the inauguration, on January 6, 1853, the Pierce family was traveling by train from Boston to Concord. The train derailed. Franklin and Jane were uninjured. Their 11-year-old son Benny, their only surviving child, the boy who had absorbed the love of 2 dead brothers whom his parents adored with an intensity that their losses had made almost unbearable, was killed instantly when the car he was in rolled over. He died in front of his parents. There is almost nothing adequate to say about this. The death of a child is a wound that many marriages do not survive. The circumstances here were uniquely terrible. The public character of the accident, the proximity of the inauguration, the absolute inability to grieve privately, the way the loss fell on parents who had already lost 2 other children and had concentrated everything on this one surviving boy. Jane Pierce concluded that God had taken Benny because he was removing a distraction. that Franklin needed to be fully focused on the presidency without the competing love of a child, and that this was the divine mechanism for ensuring that focus. This interpretation of her son's death, which she wrote about in letters to relatives, tells you everything about the state of mind she carried into the White House. Not just grief, but grief converted into a religious narrative about punishment and sacrifice that made it, if anything, harder to bear. She did not appear at the inauguration. She did not appear in public for months. She spent the first year of the presidency largely in her White House bedroom, writing letters to her dead son. The social functions of the First Lady, the entertaining, the hosting, the diplomatic presence that the role required, fell to Abby Kent Means, a friend and relative who came to Washington to help. Pierce delivered his inaugural address on March 4, 1853. It was, those who were there agreed, a remarkable performance. He spoke from memory, without notes, for over 3,000 words in the cold of a March day in Washington, to a large crowd. He was articulate, composed, passionate. He spoke about national unity, about the dangers of sectionalism, about his commitment to the Constitution and the Union. He did not use a Bible for his oath of office. He affirmed rather than swore. Whether this was a statement of religious principle or simply a personal choice, it was noted. He was 48 years old, vigorous and handsome, talented and charming, and utterly hollowed out by grief. His wife was upstairs writing to a dead child, and he was about to begin the presidency. Pierce's cabinet was a deliberate attempt to represent every major faction of the Democratic Party, Northern and Southern, old and new, conservative and moderate. It was, in the language of political science, a coalition cabinet, designed to bring everyone in and keep everyone happy. The problem with coalition cabinets is that they're held together by the desire of everyone to be included, not by any shared direction. When a hard decision comes, and hard decisions always come, the coalition fractures at exactly the moment you need it to hold. The hardest decision came in 1854, and it came from a direction that Pierce might have anticipated but chose not to. Stephen Douglas, the Democratic senator from Illinois, wanted to organize the Nebraska Territory. This was the vast, mostly unsettled land west of Missouri and Iowa that would eventually become Nebraska, Kansas, North Dakota, South Dakota, and parts of other states. Organizing it into territories, the first step toward eventual statehood, required a bill through Congress. The problem was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The Missouri Compromise had drawn a line across the continent at 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude and declared that slavery would not be permitted in the territory north of that line, with the exception of Missouri itself. The Nebraska Territory was almost entirely north of that line. Under the Missouri Compromise, it would be organized as free territory. Southern senators refused to allow this. They had been watching the demographic arithmetic for decades. Free states were growing faster than slave states. The free state advantage in the House was already decisive. The Senate was the last defensive line, and the organization of Nebraska as free territory would eventually produce 2 or 3 or 4 new free states, cementing the free state majority in the Senate and leaving the South permanently outvoted on any issue that touched slavery. Douglas wanted the railroad. A transcontinental railroad was the great infrastructure project of the era, and Douglas wanted it to run through Chicago and the Central Corridor, which required organizing the Nebraska Territory along the way. He needed Southern votes to pass his bill. Southern senators told him their price: repeal the Missouri Compromise, allow the territories to decide for themselves on slavery, the principle called popular sovereignty. If the settlers of Kansas and Nebraska chose to permit slavery, that was their right. If they chose to prohibit it, that too was their right. Douglas accepted the price. He drafted what became the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he went to see President Pierce. What happened at that meeting, and in the several meetings and conversations that surrounded it, has been reconstructed from various accounts, and the picture it produces is deeply unflattering to Pierce. Pierce had reservations about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He knew it would be explosive. He knew it would reopen a wound that the Compromise of 1850 had barely managed to close. He knew it would outrage the northern wing of his party and potentially destroy the coalition he was trying to hold together. He signed on anyway. The reasons are multiple and interlocking. He was susceptible to the arguments of the Southern Democrats in his cabinet and their allies in Congress, who told him this was a matter of principle, that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional from the start, an overreach of federal power that violated the equal rights of Southern citizens. He was susceptible to Douglas's charm and political momentum. He was susceptible to his own ideology, which told him that the federal government had no business interfering with the domestic institutions of any state or territory, that slavery was a local matter, that the proper response to the slavery question at the federal level was silence. And he was susceptible to something harder to name, a belief that if he could get through this crisis, if he could just hold the party together, if everyone would just calm down, it would be fine. That the threat of disunion was the real danger, and that anything that diffused the immediate crisis, even at the cost of reopening old wounds, was the right call. He was wrong about almost everything, but he wasn't stupid. He knew there would be a reaction. He described the Kansas-Nebraska Act in private conversation as a squall, something to weather. He genuinely believed it would blow over. It did not blow over. The reaction in the North was unlike anything that had happened since the Fugitive Slave Act. The Missouri Compromise had been in place for 34 years. For a generation of Americans, it was not simply a law, it was a foundation. It was the agreement that had made sectional coexistence possible. It was the thing you could point to when Southern politicians pushed too hard and say, "Here is the line. Here is the deal we made. This far and no further." Repealing it felt like a betrayal. It felt, to millions of Northerners who had been willing to tolerate the Fugitive Slave Act, willing to let slavery alone where it existed, willing to hold their noses and maintain the peace, like proof that the Southern demands would never stop. That there was no concession large enough, no compromise stable enough, no deal that the slave power would honor once it became inconvenient. The anti-Nebraska coalition, furious Whigs, Northern Democrats who felt abandoned by their president, free soilers, anti-slavery activists, began forming almost immediately. Out of this coalition, over the next 2 years emerged the Republican Party. The Republican Party was founded on a single organizing principle: no slavery in the territories. That's it. Not abolition in the South, not interference with slavery where it already existed. Just, the territories will be free. This was, by the standards of 1854, a relatively moderate position. It was also, to the Southern political mind, existential. If the territories were going to be free, the future arithmetic of the Senate was clear. The South would be a permanent minority in both houses within a decade. There would be nothing to stop the eventual federal restriction of slavery everywhere. Franklin Pierce did not see it this way. Franklin Pierce saw the Republican Party as a dangerous sectional faction that was threatening the Union by making demands that the South could not accept. He spent the rest of his presidency and most of the rest of his life denouncing Republican politicians, and especially, later, Abraham Lincoln, as the real authors of disunion, the real threat to the country, the real traitors. The irony is almost too painful to contemplate. Pierce, who had spent his entire political career in service of the Union, who believed in the Union with something close to religious intensity, had taken the action that made disunion inevitable, and then spent his declining years blaming the people who tried to stop it. Kansas became the testing ground for popular sovereignty, and what it produced was not democracy. It produced a war. The Kansas-Nebraska Act said that the settlers of Kansas would decide whether the territory would be slave or free. This was, in principle, a reasonable idea. In practice, it turned Kansas into a battlefield where armed groups from both sides flooded into the territory specifically to influence the vote. Missouri slaveholders crossed the border to vote illegally in Kansas territorial elections, stuffing ballot boxes and intimidating free soil settlers. Northern anti-slavery groups organized and funded emigrant parties to settle Free Soil Kansans in the territory as fast as possible. The result was two competing territorial governments, each claiming legitimacy, each backed by armed partisans. The pro-slavery government at Lecompton had been installed through fraudulent elections. The Free Soil government at Topeka had been established by settlers who refused to recognize the Lecompton government's authority. Both sides were arming themselves. And then the violence came. In May 1856, pro-slavery forces attacked the Free Soil town of Lawrence, sacking it, destroying printing presses, burning buildings. 3 days later, a man named John Brown, a radical abolitionist who had brought several of his sons to Kansas with the explicit intention of fighting the slave power, led a midnight raid on the settlement at Pottawatomie Creek and murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers, hacking them to death with broadswords. Bleeding Kansas. The phrase entered the American vocabulary and stayed there. Pierce's response to all of this was to side, essentially, with the pro-slavery government. He recognized the Lecompton government as the legitimate authority in the territory. He sent federal forces to suppress the Free Soil resistance. He issued proclamations denouncing the Free Soil settlers as illegal insurgents. He was not motivated by a love of slavery. Pierce personally found slavery morally distasteful and said so in private. He was motivated by his ideology. The Lecompton government had been elected by the legal voters of Kansas, and to refuse to recognize it was to undermine the principle of popular sovereignty that was the only constitutional framework he believed could hold the country together. The problem, and it was a problem that his critics pointed out loudly and repeatedly, was that the Lecompton elections had been fraudulent. The government he was defending had been installed by illegal voters from another state. Popular sovereignty in Kansas had not produced a democratic outcome. It had produced a rigged outcome, and Pierce was defending the rig. He couldn't see it, or couldn't say it. The distinction by this point hardly mattered. While Kansas was burning, something happened in Washington that is one of the most shocking single events in American congressional history, and which illustrates better than almost anything else the temperature of the country in 1856. Charles Sumner was a Republican senator from Massachusetts, one of the most eloquent and uncompromising anti-slavery voices in Congress. On May 19th and 20th, 1856, the same week as the attack on Lawrence, Kansas, Sumner delivered a speech on the Senate floor called "The Crime Against Kansas." It was 2 days of sustained, scorching rhetoric about the pro-slavery conspiracy he believed was destroying the Republic. It was also personally insulting about several of his Senate colleagues, including Andrew Butler of South Carolina, whom Sumner mocked with a specific cruelty that was, even by the standards of the era's political invective, over the line. 2 days after the speech, Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina and a relative of Butler's, walked onto the Senate floor while Sumner was working at his desk. Brooks had brought a metal-tipped gutta-percha cane. He told Sumner he had insulted Senator Butler, and then he began beating him over the head with the cane. Sumner was trapped under his desk, which was bolted to the floor. He couldn't escape. Brooks beat him until the cane broke. Sumner was so severely injured that he couldn't return to the Senate for more than 3 years. The traumatic head injuries caused lasting neurological damage. The Southern reaction was to celebrate. Brooks received commemorative canes from admirers across the South. Southern newspapers praised him. The message was clear and was received as intended. This is what we do to people who say these things about us. The Northern reaction was volcanic. The image of Sumner bloodied at his desk, beaten by a Southern congressman for giving a Senate speech, became one of the most powerful pieces of Republican propaganda in the party's history. Massachusetts kept Sumner's Senate seat empty for 3 years while he recovered. A silent, constant accusation. The empty chair. Franklin Pierce said nothing publicly that was adequate to the moment. He privately thought the speech had been provocative. He was incapable of taking the political temperature of his country accurately enough to understand that this was not a moment for nuance. The Democratic Party convention in 1856 refused to renominate Pierce. This is a stark verdict. A sitting president from the party that controls the White House denied renomination by his own party after a single term. It had not happened before. It said everything about how completely Pierce had failed. Failed not just by his own lights, but by the party's assessment of its electoral prospects. James Buchanan was nominated instead. Buchanan, who had been a leading candidate in 1852 and had been fortunate enough to be in London as minister to Britain during the entire Kansas-Nebraska disaster, which meant his hands were clean in a way Pierce's were not. Pierce took the rejection badly. He didn't show it publicly. He was too controlled, too charming, too practiced in the performance of equanimity for that. But privately, the rejection confirmed a darkness that had been gathering since the train accident, since Benny's death, since the unraveling of everything he had tried to build. He left Washington in March 1857, returned to Concord with Jane, and tried to reconstruct a private life in the wreckage of a public career. It didn't work. Jane was ill. She had been ill throughout the presidency, the grief and the anxiety taking a physical toll that never fully lifted. She died in 1863 of tuberculosis after years of declining health. Their marriage had been a love story with a very long, very painful ending. Pierce drank more. He traveled to Europe, to the Caribbean, in search of something he couldn't name and never quite found. He maintained his political positions with a consistency that, depending on your perspective, was either principled loyalty to his convictions or a catastrophic failure to update his understanding of what was happening to his country. The Civil War, when it began in April 1861, produced in Pierce a reaction that was consistent with everything he had believed for 30 years and also, by that point, monstrous in its political implications. He opposed the war. Not the Confederate cause. He wasn't a Confederate sympathizer in the sense of wanting the South to win. But he opposed the Union's prosecution of the war on the grounds that Lincoln's measures, the suspension of habeas corpus, the blockade, the draft, the eventual Emancipation Proclamation, were unconstitutional violations of the rights of states and citizens that were more dangerous to the Republic than secession itself. This position made him, in wartime, essentially a spokesman for the Copperhead faction, the Northern Democrats who opposed the war and were widely regarded by Republicans and by the public at large as traitors. In July 1863, Pierce gave a speech at a Democratic rally in Concord that was heard as exactly that, a denunciation of Lincoln's war measures, a call for negotiated peace, a suggestion that the president was a tyrant, destroying the very Constitution he claimed to defend. The speech was delivered on the same day the Battle of Gettysburg ended, one of the bloodiest battles of the war, in which Union forces had turned back the Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania at an enormous cost. The timing was catastrophically bad. The response was savage. His old friend Nathaniel Hawthorne, who had written his campaign biography in 1852 and who had maintained their friendship through all the political disasters, died in 1864 while on a trip to New Hampshire with Pierce. Pierce was with him when he died. He served as a pallbearer at the funeral. But Hawthorne had already, in his own private writings, expressed doubts about his old friend. Doubts about whether the man he had known at Bowdoin and loved for 40 years had understood anything correctly about the world they were both living in. The end of Pierce's life is one of the saddest passages in American political biography. He lived until 1869, long enough to see the war end, long enough to see Lincoln assassinated, long enough to see Reconstruction begin. He was 65 when he died, of liver cirrhosis, the official term for what decades of increasingly heavy drinking had done to him. He never recanted, never admitted that the Kansas-Nebraska Act had been a mistake, never acknowledged that the Republican Party had been right about the territorial question, never stopped believing that the crisis of the Union had been manufactured by radical troublemakers rather than by the fundamental incompatibility between a slave society and a democratic republic. He was not stupid. This is what makes it so hard to understand, even now. He was genuinely intelligent, genuinely informed, genuinely engaged with the political arguments of his time. He could not, would not, make the adjustment that the evidence demanded. Part of this was ideology. He had built his entire worldview on the premise that the Union was held together by restraint, Northern restraint specifically, the willingness of Northern politicians and voters to leave Southern institutions alone. When things went wrong, his framework demanded that the problem be located in the breakdown of that restraint. It couldn't be located in the demands of the slave power, because acknowledging that would have meant acknowledging that the entire premise of his political life had been wrong. Part of it was personal. He had sacrificed his wife's happiness, his family's privacy, his children's lives. One to a train accident, two to illness, for the public life that had ended in failure and humiliation. To admit that the positions he had taken had been catastrophically wrong would have meant that those sacrifices had been made for something not just unsuccessful, but actively harmful. Some people can make that admission. Pierce couldn't. What is Franklin Pierce's historical legacy? He is ranked consistently near the bottom of presidential rankings, in the company of Millard Fillmore, James Buchanan, and Andrew Johnson, the pre- and post-war presidents who failed the most consequentially to address the central moral and political crisis of their era. The argument for Pierce that his defenders make is essentially this: he was a prisoner of his ideology and his time. He did what he believed was right, and judging him by the standards of the 1860s or the 1960s or today is anachronistic and unfair. He was a man of the 1840s trying to apply the solutions of the 1820s to the crisis of the 1850s, and if that failed, it was because the crisis had grown beyond the capacity of the available tools. There is something to this. Pierce's ideology, the ideology of democratic unity above all, of non-interference with slavery, of the Union as a thing to be preserved at any price, was not his alone. It was the mainstream of the Northern Democratic Party for a generation. Hundreds of politicians held it. Most of them are not remembered at all. The argument against Pierce is that he had an unusual amount of power and used it in an unusually consequential direction. The Kansas-Nebraska Act didn't happen without him. A different president in 1854 might have refused Douglas's bargain, might have recognized that some prices for Southern support were too high, might have held the line. Pierce didn't hold the line. He moved it. And 11 years later, 600,000 people were dead. There's one more thing that deserves to be said about Franklin Pierce, and it's the thing that makes his story genuinely tragic rather than simply disastrous. He loved his country. Not as a slogan, not as a performance, but deeply, personally, with the intensity of a man whose father had fought for it in the Revolution and who had grown up believing it was the most important thing on earth. The Union was sacred to him. The Constitution was sacred to him. The idea that Americans could govern themselves, that the democratic experiment could succeed, was sacred to him. And everything he did to protect those things helped destroy them. He spent his life trying to hold together a coalition that required, as the price of unity, the continued existence and expansion of a system of human bondage. He succeeded in holding the coalition together until the moment it exploded, and the explosion was larger for having been delayed. He prevented the confrontation over slavery that the 1840s and 1850s seemed to be building toward, and the confrontation that came in 1861 was worse, bloodier, more total, more destructive than anything that might have happened earlier. He wanted so much to be the man who saved the Union. He became instead one of the men who made it impossible to save the Union without a war. Charming, brilliant, tragic Franklin Pierce. The president who could make everyone in a room feel seen and valued, who couldn't look at his country clearly enough to see what was actually happening in it. The man who loved the Union so much he helped break it. He died in Concord in November 1869, largely alone, largely forgotten, his reputation already reduced to the cautionary footnote it has occupied ever since. He would have hated being forgotten. He was a man who needed to be loved, who needed to matter, who needed the room to feel his presence. History gave him something different, a lesson, a long, expensive, blood-soaked lesson, written in other people's suffering, about what happens when a man is too afraid of conflict to face the truth in front of him. Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, the most talented man who ever destroyed his own country.